Good morning. Well, this morning I actually have a couple of handouts for those of you who are in the adult Bible class with us. We're going to be taking a look today at the worldview that was prevalent in the Roman Empire at the time the gospel message began to go out. As we move through church history, we're going to begin to talk about different heresies, different movements that were non-Christian movements that developed because of the marrying between the Christian or biblical worldview and the philosophical underpinnings of how society worked. We see that even today, and as we get closer, that will make more sense. But we're familiar with the worldview today of scientific naturalism, of postmodernism. So those things don't present as much of a challenge to us. And so in order to be able to communicate and dig through church history and make sense of it, and actually to enhance our understanding of what is written in the Bible, it is important for us to have at least a working knowledge, a definitional understanding of how the early church was influenced by the worldview that was present. In fact, Paul, writing to the Colossians, wrote that this warning: see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So Paul, in writing to the Colossians, did I say Corinthians the first time? If I did, it was a 1 cup of coffee mistake. Haven't had that second cup yet. He understood that they would know what these philosophies are, what these things from human tradition were, and that they would be able to recognize them. So for us to sit in their world and to hear what was spoken, it's important to at least have some understanding of it. So we're here, Greek philosophy, and I did not commit to what we're going to cover next week because I'm not 100% certain how far we're going to get today. It depends on your questions as far as, because some of this stuff is very different from the way that we think about things today. Some of the similar resources, Lane has this book, A Concise History of Christian Thought, but just inside of it are two major thinkers of early Christianity, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. And they dealt very much with what was called Gnosticism, which we'll look at the end of today's lecture, hopefully. So just those two little paragraphs on pages 10 through 14 can give you a little bit more understanding from today's class. Roger Olson, Critics and Cultists Cause Confusion. This is a sub-chapter in the Story of Christian Theology on pages 28 through 39. This would be also helpful reading to augment your understanding of what we covered today. I actually printed out chapter 5, arguing about the event for you, and gave that to you because it's got a good section in the back about Gnosticism, and it's pretty plain language, as he confesses in the title, in plain language. R.C. Sproul. Again, this would be an excellent resource. There's a book that accompanies it that has a little bit more detail as well. I can get that to you if you'd like. But if you get all the way through Aristotle Part 1 and Part 2, you will get to where we're going to cover today, and that will very much help you get your fingerhold, your foothold in understanding that philosophy. Today we've got 5 parts. We're going to talk about in the beginning. We're going to try to explain the crisis in worldview that was developed between a philosopher named Heraclitus and Parmenides. In like 15 minutes, we're going to cover the philosophy of Socrates, or Socrates, as Ted and Bill would say, or Bill and Ted would say, Plato and Aristotle. And then we're going to look at the only 2 philosophies that are mentioned by name in the Bible. That's in Acts chapter 17 by Paul as he is in Athens. And that is the philosophy of the Stoics and the Epicureans. And then finally, the worldview that was most prevalent as the apostles had died and the elders who followed them began to kind of matriculate up into this office of bishop, this new kind of senior elder position began to kind of foment and come to the top of the church. One of the principal heresies, or actually heresy is not the right word because it was an anti-Christian philosophy that arose, was Gnosticism. One of the earliest Gnostics was a man named Celsus, sort of like the measure of temperature, right? Celsius, but no I-U-S, just Celsus. And it was almost like a rite of passage for an early apostolic father to write a book against Celsus. Just about everybody had something against Celsus. So that's the overview of what we hope to cover. Again, the goal here is that when you read Scripture, when you hear things even today in our culture and our understanding of Christianity, that you could anchor that back to the beginning, the secular worldview response to Christianity, and help kind of separate that. What is biblical Christianity, and what was the kind of the infection that came in from the worldview that was present. So we'll pray and get started. Father, I thank you once again that the evidence, the record, the writings of your word have persisted against all these attacks. And Lord, that we are able to identify the wiles of the devil and be able to resist them. I ask that the study today, as we look at the worldview at that time, would be an encouragement to us as we look at our world today and we see the way the world seems to think about things today, and would be a blessing to us as we gain confidence that you have preserved the church through this before, and you will preserve it until your return. And I ask this in Jesus' name. All right. In the beginning, ... We live in the United States. We have a very, very, almost 100% influence in our worldview from Western philosophy. There are elements of what's called Eastern mysticism, but they came not directly from the East, but through the influence of Western philosophy. So as we're going to look at philosophy, it would be impossible for us to begin at the end of every branch at the tree and try to go back. We have to pick a particular branch to follow back and start at that branch. And so we're going to be primarily focused on what's called Western philosophy. We live in the West as opposed to China or India or Japan or even Russia, Turkey. So we are Westerners, and our worldview is very Western in worldview. So as we go back and we try to identify what was the kind of the seminal moment, the driving factor that really began to shape random people thinking into a systematic point of view, what was the main problem that drove people to gather together and try to answer questions? That problem, that question, was that they looked out at the world and they saw grass, and they saw horses, and they saw rivers, and they saw stars and the moon and the sun. And they knew there was a relationship there because the sun was necessary for the grass to grow. The water from the rivers was necessary for the grass to grow. The grass had to be there or the horse couldn't eat. Right? So they knew that somehow, in some way, there was some connection between the many things, the phenomena, what they observed in the world. And they had this hunch, this belief that the connection between them was either because they shared some sort of substance with one another, or there was the same thing that was responsible for the order and the movement of all these things. So this is sometimes put simply as the question of the one and the many. Even our word today, universe, is a portmanteau. Is that the way when you take two words and you smash them together and you make a new word? Is that what that's called, a portmanteau? Well, it's unity and diversity. And you take the T at the end of unity, and you take the die at the beginning of diversity, and you put them together, and it's the unity in diversity. It's the universe, and the place where you learn about the universe is the university. Even our language today is affected by this very ancient way of thinking. And probably the first person to really give an argument for how all of this comes together was a guy by the name of Thales of Miletus. And he argued that the thing that underlied everything, the substance that gave the answer to how things could all be different but together, how they could be moving, was that it had to be some way connected with water. And this seems a little bit crazy to us, but if you think about it, living things don't keep living without water. In Thales' experience, everything he saw was in the form of a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Water is ice, wet water, or steam, a vapor. When he looked out at the oceans, they seemed to move all of themselves. He didn't have an understanding of gravity and tidal motion. He described water as being hylozoistic. The next time you're, on a date with your girlfriend or husband or wife or whatever, you can say, hey, let's go get into the hylozoistomobile, right? Because that's what the word means, automobile. It's self-moving. And so he wasn't really that crazy. In fact, Heraclitus, who we've already mentioned, credits Thales with having predicted a solar eclipse that occurred in 585 BC. Now, I don't know how much credit you give yourself for observing the things around you and putting them together, but I would bet without the internet, none of y'all, and myself included, could predict a solar eclipse just by looking at the stars at night while out camping or whatever. So this dude was smart, but his answer was water. Later philosophies would say, no, it's not water, it's fire. Fire seems to be necessary for life. Fire seems to move substances like trees from tree into heat and light and ash. It somehow has the power to change these things. Still others would say, no, it's earth. I take this seed and I put it down into the earth, and all of a sudden it becomes a grapevine or an olive tree or whatever. So it's earth. Others would say, no, it's air. Just like water, living things need air. Even they had a rudimentary understanding of how plants used air. And so they began to say, okay, no, this is the thing, or this is the thing, or this is the thing. And still later philosophers, and we're moving at a super high, fast speed here. So if you have a background in philosophy, don't hate on me, okay? I'm trying to give you a general overview so that when we speak of these things, we have a working knowledge, not, a detailed knowledge. If you are excited about this, we can spend hours talking about it. It's not the purpose today. So other philosophers would say, okay, you can't get there with one thing. Earth, wind, that's the band, right? Earth, wind, and fire. I don't know why they didn't want water. Probably because they were drinking beer or something. But they said, no, you can't have just one of them. You need all four of them together. Earth, air, fire, and water. And it's those four. But the problem with that is now you've gone from the search for the one thing, and now you're back to the many. You've now got four things, and you haven't really answered the question. So philosophers say, well, there must be that fifth thing, that essence, that fifth essence, the quintessence that underlies those four things. And we still use that word in our language today, right? What is quintessential? It's the thing that is absolutely necessary and underlies, right? The thing without which it wouldn't be that thing. That is the quintessential point. And so that actually goes all the way back to answering this question of the one in the many in ancient Greek Western philosophy. And so they said there must be something, and we don't really know what that thing is. The essence of ultimate reality then began to get divided between two main questions. Question one is the nature of that thing physical or spiritual? Does it have a body and an extended being, or is it just spirit element? That's the first question. What is the nature of its being? The second question is it just one thing? Or is it a plurality of things? And so as you hear these philosophers and you hear them talk about it, you say, okay, this guy, Thales, believed it was all one thing, and he believed that one thing had a physical presence. It was incorporated, right? It was corporeal. He called it water. But Empedocles and Anaxagoras said, no, it is physical, but it's earth, wind, fire, and water. So it's these four things together. Others would say, no, it's not a thing that's extended. It's a spirit type thing, incorporeal, but it is still one thing. This would be what Aristotle would end up with his ultimate cause, he would call it, as we get in there. And this, by the way, is a chart from R.C. Sproul's Consequences of Ideas. So we end up having this impasse in our things. Physical is the underlying answer to the one and the many a corporeal? Can you reach out and touch it, or is it spirit? Is it just one thing, or is it many things? And so this challenge was taken up over and over again, but there was this moment, this significant writing that happened between two different philosophers. And we don't know who wrote first necessarily, but they began to challenge one another. And the first guy was a guy named, I think Heraclitus wrote first. It doesn't really matter in the end. But he is famous for making the statement, you cannot step into the same river twice. Has anyone ever heard that expression? No? Okay, good. I'm talking to the right crowd then. Heraclitus believed, and he isn't necessarily wrong, that you cannot step into the same river twice. And what did he mean by that? He meant that suppose we go out to the Jackson River, just across the street here. As we are going over there, we are changing. We're getting a little bit older, skin cells are sloughing off, some other cells in our body are dividing. We're making new memories as we see new things, as we walk out there. The smells come in and cause us to remember things, and the little pathways in our brain change. The change is very small, and we may not be able to see it, but we get to the river, and we step into the river. Now, when we have stepped into the river, water has been flowing past, taking little grains of sand. Different fish are at different places. The temperature of the water around your foot went up, even just an infinitesimal amount because of your body heat. And so then when you step out of that river, you're still changing as this is going on, and the river is still flowing, and it is still changing. So when you go to step back into the river, although it has the same name and you have the same name, both of you have changed as that has happened, and so something about the both of you are different. He argued that everything that is not really is, but rather is becoming. Everything is in a state of change and movement. And he said this change and this movement can't just be random because things work together. Things have consequences. They're balanced, and And so he said this, he gave this name, he said this reason that directs all this change, and the purpose behind that reason, he gave them the words logos and telos. And so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, that word for word is logos. Now, John is not dependent on Heraclitus' understanding of logos. He is thinking of it as the Word, as in the inscripturated Word, the Word of God. But nonetheless, God makes it clear, especially in Romans, that just by looking at the world, we can know God's invisible attributes. Heraclitus knew God's invisible attributes. And so when John wrote this to a society that already had an understanding of logos that was different from maybe the biblical one, and he wanted to move them. He wanted to connect with them at their ground and move them toward the biblical understanding. We're going to see this later as we look at Acts chapter 17. Heraclitus' example for this constant movement was fire. Fire needs to constantly be fed, and it constantly produces change. It's never the same. Now, against him was a guy by the name of Parmenides. Parmenides looked at Heraclitus' statement and he said, no, if everything is always becoming, then it never really is, and if it isn't, then it isn't, and nothing is. But there are things because we can see them and experience them. So there must be something that actually is, and the change that we see is an illusion. It's not real change. It's just we perceive this change sort of happening, and it looks like we lost the, so here it goes. So you will have seen reflector 4 crashed. Is that correct? Okay, so don't open reflector 4 just yet. I'm going to reconnect to the computer, and you're going to have to tell me the 4-digit code. I think it's... Sorry about this, guys. Oh, you did not have to tell it to me. All right, so you can now... Yeah. You need to reopen NDI scan converter. Yeah, we need to sit down and walk through this procedure, don't we? So if you look at the very top of the screen, do you see a name of a program kind of grayed out at the top? All right, just click anywhere inside of the desktop. So that goes to the word Finder. Now you should be able to open Reflector 4 and select the right slide. All right, so where were we at? We were at the Heraclitus and Parmenides discussing, is everything changing, or is there something that really is, and change is just illusion? And so this created a complete lack of confidence within society, that they could even know anything. Because if these two great geniuses couldn't agree on the essential nature of what is, how are we, the common person, supposed to get there? And so what they did is they came up with this radical skepticism. Are you not able to open Reflector 4? File. So now you need to go to NDI scan converter. Now that Reflector 4 is going again, you got to go back to NDI scan converter, select File, Reflector 4, and the big screen. Oh, because we're back off air. Look at that. We got kicked off again. No worries. I'll pull it back up. We might need to make this a wired connection. There we are. See, I see it up there, and there it is. All right. So we have this skepticism because the greats, the philosophical greats, couldn't agree about what it was. And so in the common man, in the culture of that day, it devolved into these three primary symptoms. The first symptom was that they decided that no truth, did you get it, Doug? All right, that no truth exists. And they said, even if actual truth existed, you and I can't know it. And even if truth existed and we could know it, we wouldn't be able to communicate it, so we wouldn't be able to share it with one another. This is exactly the same thing that is true of our postmodern society today. And it exists for the exact same reason, and that is because in the academy, in the colleges, in the universities, in the media, in the high-level politicians, they have disagreement over what is the fundamental nature of reality. Is the world created and directed by God according to his principles and purposes? Or is the world a consequence of billions of years and random chance, and there is no purpose? And both sides adamantly hold to that truth. For ancient Greek philosophy, it was between, are things constantly changing, or is there something that's really itself, in and of itself, right? As Popeye would say, I am that I am that I am. And so the everyday man said, hey, look, truth can't possibly exist. Even if it did, we couldn't know it. And even if we could know it, we couldn't communicate it with one another. This last point, incommunicable, is what we're beginning to see more and more with the idea of postmodernism, that words don't have real meaning. When I use the term woman and you use the term woman, they don't have the same underlying meaning in our postmodern culture. The second thing that was the symptom of this radical skepticism was that justice was just a term that the weak-minded used to make up for their weakness and try to get fair play. But in reality, might made right. Whoever was in power could put other people in power and choose to make their ideal or their goal the most important goal and the most important purpose. And if that made everybody else suffer, too bad, we're in charge. Might made right. There is no ultimate truth that can be understood. The third was that, wrong button, knowledge exists inside of man. The only thing that can be known is what exists internal to you. And since we know that our sense perception is flawed, we know that sometimes we can't solve that Sudoku puzzle or that Wordle puzzle or whatever it is. So we know our thinking is flawed in some way. And if that's where knowledge and truth exist, then knowledge must also be fundamentally flawed. And so everything became pragmatic. What works? How do I make and sell more widgets, more lamps, more olive oil, more camel hamburgers or whatever, you know? Like that became the purpose of life. It just devolved. And the goals and purposes of society became very, very dangerous for the average man. And onto this scene came a man named Socrates. Socrates is famous for saying at his trial, he was brought to trial because he did not believe in the Greek gods, and he taught that the Greek gods were not real. He didn't believe in any god, but he also didn't believe in those, and that was a real problem. So they put him on trial for his life. And the prosecutor was making the case that you can't use reason and logic and experience to show that the Greek gods are not true. In fact, you shouldn't examine your life at all to think about it. And Socrates' reply to his prosecutor was that the unexamined life is not worth living. I would rather die than give up thinking about truth and justice and knowledge and the possibility of having them. And so he was known as the Gadfly of Athens because he would go throughout the city and he would ask these questions of the average citizen and actually make them think about their life and what they were doing and where they were going and whether it mattered. And this was causing uproar in the society. And so he believed and he taught that both knowledge and truth were possible to come by learning. Radical idea. And he said this learning process is done through this dialogue with other people, this dialogue of asking those questions and examining our life. And so his most famous student is a man by the name of Plato. Plato is not his name. Plato is his nickname. He was a participant in the Greek games, and he was a wrestler. And he apparently was a very physically imposing man, because the word Plato means broad shoulders. And he had this analogy that he used to share his view of how the world really was. We're at 9:30? All right. We might be getting into Gnosticism next week. He had his illustration. He said, imagine there was a bunch of people who from birth were locked and chained in this cave. And at the mouth of the cave was this screen that prevented you from seeing outside. And the people inside the cave were positioned so they could see that screen, but they couldn't see each other and they couldn't communicate with each other. And he said, so every time something happened and went by outside the cave, they didn't see the thing itself. They saw the shadow of that thing. And if the light was just right and bouncing through the cave, they wouldn't see the other people in the cave, but they would see their shadow reflected on that screen that was in the cave. He said, this is how the world is. We're not seeing what really is. We're seeing the image of it or the copy of it. But we really are. He said, we are real and we are material. And our real material substance has somehow received the real that's outside of the cave. We are receptacles, material receptacles of the actual real. And that actual real, he said, is the idea. This is a table, right? And how do we all know that this is a table? Some tables have 4 legs. Some tables have 3. Some have leaves inside of them that you can expand them and close them. Some are lower. Some are higher. Why do we all call this a table? Plato would say because out there in the other world, in the world of the ideal, is an actual thing. Not an actual material thing, but a thing that has real being, that is a table. And every table we see is a receptacle of some kind of part of that, some imperfect part of that ideal form. I'm not going to ask if that makes sense, but I'll ask, do you understand what Plato is trying to say? When we share the idea of car or chair or piano, the only reason we can communicate that together is because each of our receptacles have a form, an imperfect copy of the ideal form of personness that also existed in the ideal realm with the ideal piano or chair or table. And we have a memory and a recollection, flawed as it may be, of that thing, that ideal form that really exists in the other world. And because of that, knowledge was not a posteriori. And I use the foreign language word there because that is what you'll see over and over again if you ever read anything about philosophy. And what this means is after you experience it. Plato would argue you don't gain knowledge by experiencing things. Remember, he said learning came by dialogue and questioning. Socrates said learning came by dialogue and questioning. We don't really know anything about Socrates except through Plato's writing. So it's hard to say where does Plato end and where does Socrates begin, because we hear about them all through the same person. So Socrates and Plato both agree you gain knowledge by being led out of your ignorance into a memory, an a priori, before you experience it, thing that will remind you of what was the ideal form. Now, you could also be misled. Okay, so he had this idea that the mind was 3 parts. He said the mind was composed of reason, which is awareness of what you wanted or awareness of what was going on. It was a part of your mind was the spirit, and that was your drive to do something about what you were aware of or what you reasoned about. And he said there was a third element, though, and that was appetite. Appetite was this influence to satisfy the material receptacle, that the ideal form inside of you. So salvation for Plato would be to liberate the ideal form that is inside of you away from the fundamentally flawed and imperfect physical receptacle that is blocking the memory and blocking the reason, blocking the awareness, that's limiting the drive of the spirit of the mind from achieving all that it can achieve. And this was his worldview. Now, his most famous student was a man by the name of Aristotle. Aristotle said, no, I don't think that the ideal realm that you're talking about in these forms have real being in the sense that you're using it, Plato. Aristotle is probably most famous for articulating or expressing the laws of logic, things like something cannot be and not be at the same time, in the same place, and in the same relationship. In other words, I cannot be in my car and not be in my car at the same time and in the same relationship. Now, I could physically be sitting in my car and, on the phone with somebody, and you could say, rightly, I am not in the car, because mentally I'm paying attention to the phone, and I could get into a car accident, right? But the relationship of in my car and not in the car is different. In one way, I'm saying physically. The other way, I'm saying mentally. He says you can't say you are physically here and not physically here at the same time and in the same, or you can't be. Some character. I can't be 5'10" and not 5'10" at the same time and at the same relationship. I used to be 5'11". Get launched off enough aircraft carriers, you get shorter. So Aristotle's logic, he said, was the instrument of knowing. Contrary to Socrates that said questioning and answering those questions was the way of learning, Aristotle said, no, it has to be logically true. It can't violate logic. He said, you can know truth formally, but something that is formally true does not necessarily have real being. So Aristotle would say, I can know of a one-horned animal. That can formally be true. I can know of a horse. That can formally be true. I can know of a white horse. Now, a white horse with one horn is not real in real being, even though there's no logical reason it couldn't be formally true. So Aristotle identified that just because something is true doesn't mean it actually has real being. He said, because that's true, then things that have real being have to have something in addition to being true about their nature. that thing that is true about their nature is its substance. Now, what you say about that substance, what you say, how much it weighs, how many are there, where is it located, how old is it, what color is it, those properties about the substance, those postulations, those prepositions, he called categories. And so he argued that Plato's ideals are not real being out separate from the substance. They only have real being when they exist with the substance. In other words, if you separate your divine form and ideal from your physical body, the divine form and ideal wouldn't have real being anymore. He said that these categories that we use to express things and all agree 5 is 5 and red is red, he said that is a real category, but it doesn't have actual substance to it. So a thing has a form, substance, and it has properties, accidents. To this day, in the Roman Catholic Church, when they celebrate communion, they believe that the physical body and physical blood of Christ is present in the bread and the wine at the Mass. Now, they don't believe they have re-sacrificed Christ on the cross, as some Protestants crassly charge them with. Rather, what they believe is that separate from the time Jesus was crucified to the time the Mass is celebrated, the physical presence of Christ has somehow come forward and come back into existence, even though it's the same flesh and blood that was sacrificed, around 31 to 33 AD. But the way they say the reason it still tastes like bread and the reason it still tastes like wine, if you drank all of it, you could get to feeling a little funny. The reason that's true is because they say there is a double miracle occurring. And they look to Aristotle's understanding of substance and accidens, and they say the substance underlying the bread and the wine has actually changed to the body and blood of Christ. But the appearances of it, these categories, the quantity, the quality, relations, place, state, posture, all of that has remained the same. So although it tastes like bread, it's got the molecular structure of bread, it will mold like bread, the thing underneath it, the substance, is actually the body of Christ. Now, Aristotle would agree that's a miracle, because for Aristotle, the substance and the accidents must always match together. They must always cohere. Aristotle said for something to change, there must be some cause for that change. And he put these 4 causes this way. He said there's a formal cause for a thing to change. So the example he uses is making a sculpture. He said the formal cause for making a sculpture into what it is that the sculpture has this idea or plan for what the sculpture will be. That's the formal cause for the thing that determines what it's going to be. And he said there's also a material cause that goes with it, and that's the block of marble or stone that goes as part of this sculpture. He said there's also an efficient cause. What actually made that change happen? Well, that's the sculptor with his hammer and his chisel and whatever it may be. And he said the final cause is the purpose that the thing was made to be, a decoration for a house or a garden. And these things all go together. You can't separate one from another. If a guy didn't want a decoration from the house or the garden, the sculptor wouldn't have the idea. If there wasn't the marble, he couldn't then use the efficient cause. So there's this connection between them. And Aristotle, by logic, said everything that is a cause produces an effect. And everything that changes is an effect. And since we change, we had to have a cause. Our parents had to have a cause, their parents, and so on and so forth. The sun shines, something caused it. He said eventually, by resistless logic for Aristotle, he said the first cause has to be something which in and of itself is unchanging and without a cause itself. It cannot be an effect. It must be pure cause. Since accidents, properties of things change, that pure cause must be pure form or pure substance. Doesn't have to be corporeal or incorporeal. But the amazing thing about this is after hundreds and hundreds of years of this, finally Greek philosophy got in line with Hebrew thought that actually began with monotheism. And they understood that there had to be one formal first cause for everything. Now, Aristotle's first cause is, again, not the same as the Hebrew God. That's not what I'm trying to say with that bullet. What I'm trying to say is they began to think about things at this point in terms of one, monists, right, monism, and one being the cause of everything. And again, this chart came from Sproul's Consequences of Ideas. So if I have confused you up to this point, I apologize. I've done my best to make it as simple and still be true to the nature of it. So we have 15 minutes left, and the next two things we're going to get into are the Stoics and Epicureans, who are the two that go together. We might be able to, 15 minutes? All right, let's do it. All right. So the Stoics and Epicureans were rival schools of thought. They began about 300 AD. Stoicism was founded by a man named Zeno. Supposedly they get the name for their philosophy because he taught under a stoa, which is just the word for porch. Epicureanism was begun by a man named Epicurus. Both of these schools of thought who existed within this, skeptical framework, we're seeking ataraxia. That is, this acceptance of the way that things are. You don't get worked up about what happens to you, but the way that they got there, the way that they achieved peace and acceptance of what was going on was radically different. Zeno, in his school of Stoicism, taught that everything that is simply material. There is no reason, there is no logic, there is no purpose. Like Heraclitus said, there's a telos, a purpose. They said, no, it's all just predetermined. It's like a set of dominoes that you've put up. As soon as that first domino went, all the other dominoes are going to go. And whichever domino you are, you just have to be happy about falling down in your place as that domino. There was a divine spark. It exists somewhat inside of everybody, but you're not going to move up. You're not going to move down. You're going to live, eat, maybe have kids, and die. So when things happen and people make you mad and somebody steals your goat or car or whatever, don't get all worked up about it. That was determined beforehand anyhow, and there wasn't anything you could actually do to stop it. So today we say somebody is stoic about some tragedy or some event that's going on, and that they kind of force down their excitement and anger and just kind of say, well, there's nothing I could do about it anyhow. They just take it. On the other hand, Epicureanism, I might have made that word up. The Epicureans said, no, we do have free will. We do have human choice. Said, but we make bad human choices. What we should do in our life is we should seek after pleasure and try to avoid pain. But we need to understand that if we go too far in our search for pleasure, we actually get pain. Right? If you're seeking for sexual pleasure in every partner you can find, eventually one of them is going to get mad at you and cause you injury, right? Or you're going to catch some kind of disease, and now instead of pleasure, you've gotten pain. If you think that pleasure is going to the golden camel buffet and eating until you're absolutely full and sticking your finger down your throat and then doing it again, he said you're going to get overweight and bad knees and heart conditions and die early, and you're going to live uncomfortably for the years that you're alive. So they didn't seek maximum pleasure. They, through what they understood as free will choice, sought optimal pleasure. And so when we read in the Bible in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 21, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, these are the Jews that he had been teaching at the synagogue, his spirit was provoked within him, and he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with them. Now, for a long time, I used to think that these guys were the idolaters. They're not. They were anti-religion. Okay, remember the Stoics believed everything was material. Zeus and Athena and all those were just the empty, vain thoughts. That you thought you could go to the temple and get Athena to intervene on your behalf was obscene to the Stoics. The free will, human Epicurean free will said, no. It's everything is us. We just have to seek optimal pleasure, not maximal. So the Epicureans and Stoics were not the idolaters. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities. Now, the Epicureans were especially anti-religious. So here we have the Stoics saying, hey, you can be saved. You can change your fate from ultimate death to ultimate life. The Stoics said he's a babbler. The Epicureans said, no, he's teaching just another foreign god. So we can see in the words that Luke records about Paul's discussion a reflection of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophy that was true at that time, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, that's Mars Hill. Athens has a high point city on it, and on that high point is built the Acropolis. It just means the high point of the city. Right below the Acropolis is the temple of Athena Nike. Athena was the queen matriarch god of Athens. Nike is the god of victory. Athena was a warrior, so they had their temple there. And right below that was this flat area called Mars Hill. Mars was the Roman god of war. Ares was the Greek god of war. Areopagus, Ares, Mars Hill. Same word, Greek cult, Roman cult. Kind of like NASCAR, right? Jeff Gordon, Bush, whatever, same thing. Right? My NASCAR fans are going to stab me when I leave. So they said, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul then is going to address these Stoics and Epicureans as well as the people they were speaking to, which included Jews, which included people who still were teaching the pagan idolatry. So Paul, verse 22, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Now the Epicureans would take that as a huge insult. They said, no, we are free will deterministic, Everything that happens, we do to ourselves. And here Paul is saying, you guys are actually very religious. The Stoics say, no, everything's predetermined and you can't do anything. And Paul is saying that divine spark that put it all, that's your religion. So he's pointing out to them right away that although they think they're agnostic or atheistic, they are in fact very religious. We gain that additional understanding with the basic level. He says, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Remember the question about corporeal or incorporeal? What is the ultimate cause? Does it have a body or does it not have a body? Paul is addressing that, saying it doesn't have a body. It doesn't live in a temple made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live in all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So the Stoics believed where you were was determined by an impersonal force and there was nothing you could do about it. Paul here is speaking to them saying there is such a thing, but then he goes on that they should seek God. He says to the Stoics, but don't believe just because how things are is how things are supposed to be, and that you're not supposed to go to what you think of as a divine spark, as your religious, belief that they thought was non-religious. And perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Why are there so many different things? And how did life come to be? How did things get put into motion? What is that first cause of Aristotle? All of these questions that existed in the minds of the Greek philosophers, Paul was systematically dealing with them and answering them and pointing them toward God. And he says, and as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. Going back to the question of corporeal or incorporeal, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The Epicureans now he's addressing and saying it's not all human free will. You didn't form God and you can't form God's opinion. And then he cuts to now what they must do. What they must respond to this truth about their nature. He says, the times of ignorance God overlooked. In other words, y'all are ignorant and God has been patient with you. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. The evidence of that truth, by the way, Paul over and over again reaffirms that the actual resurrection of Christ was the thing that we could say, the quintessential truth that God is in fact God. So next week we're going to look at the Gnostic Heresy, which isn't necessarily Greek philosophy. This was the worldview that came out of the conflict between Greek philosophy and Christian teaching. How did then secular philosophy, that philosophy that existed as the gospel went out, how did those two interact? Thank you for any questions? Everybody's like, I am so tired, my brain hurts. I am too. You should spend, weeks and months and years with these people. Thank you. End of show.